We're going to take a look at the metabolism of fats. So lipids are going to be absorbed from our diet in the intestines and are going to be packaged into lipoproteins that are called chylomicrons. And chylomicrons are too big to fit into the capillaries, so they're going to travel through the lymphatic vessels instead. And then they're going to be dumped into the bloodstream right near the right side of the heart. And there's some enzymes called lipoprotein lipases that are located in the capillary walls. And they're going to grab the chylomicrons as they float by, and they're going to rip off part of the triglycerides and break those down. So let's just take a look at some pictures. So the first picture on the left is from chapter 20. This is figure 20.21. And on top we've got the intestine, we've got the lumen of the intestine, and we've got some lipids that you've eaten with your diet, maybe some triglycerides, and some pancreatic lipases have already broken those down into a monoglyceride and some fatty acids. And because they're hydrophobic, they can just diffuse right through the epithelial cell that makes up the intestinal wall. So they just diffuse right through. And then once they're inside the intestinal cell wall, they go to the smooth ER, where the smooth ER will rebuild the triglyceride. And then that gets sent over to the Golgi apparatus, and the Golgi apparatus will package the triglycerides up into a lipoprotein called a chylomicron. And then the chylomicron is really big, and so it's going to get moved out of this intestinal epithelial cell by exocytosis. So it gets moved out into the extracellular fluid, and then it's actually too big to fit through the little gaps between the walls of the capillaries. So it doesn't go into the blood right away. But the chylomicrons will fit through the gaps in the lacteals in these lymphatic vessels. So the chylomicrons enter into lacteals, travel through the lymphatic vessels, and then eventually these lymphatic vessels will empty into the bloodstream right next to the right atrium. And then if we move over to the figure 21.1 next door, now we've got the chylomicrons traveling through the blood, and they're going to be taking these lipids to the liver and then also to other body cells. And as they're traveling through the blood, the lipoprotein lipases in the wall of the capillary will grab the chylomicrons and tear off some of the triglycerides and break them down into monoglycerides and fatty acids. And those are hydrophobic, and so they will just diffuse right through the capillary wall and into the body cell or into the liver. And once they're into the cell, a couple things can happen. We can use the fatty acids for energy, so we can break those down and make some ATP. Or if this is an adipose cell and we don't need to make energy right now, we can store the fatty acids for later, and we can remake the triglycerides. And then if it's been a while since we've eaten and now we're running low on nutrients and energy, those adipocytes, those fat cells, can then break the triglycerides down into the fatty acid chains and the glycerol, and then release those into the blood, and then those can be taken to other cells and then used by other cells to make ATP. All right, let's take a look at these lipoproteins, because I think this gets a little confusing. And there are several different types of lipoproteins, and they're based on their density. So the largest of the lipoproteins will be the chylomicrons. So those are going to be made in the intestinal cells, and they're going to deliver the lipids from your diet, from the intestines to your body cells, and then also to your liver. And then the VLDL, those lipoproteins, VLDL stands for very low density lipoprotein. So these are just a little bit smaller than the chylomicrons, but they're very low density, meaning that they have a lot of lipids in them and not a lot of protein. So that makes them low density, meaning that they've got a lot of fat in them, they're not as dense, they're more likely to float, like if you put them in some water. So the VLDL lipoproteins are actually made by the liver, and they're going to be transporting lipids made by the liver out to the body cells. And then as the VLDL lipoproteins are traveling through the blood out to the body cells, the lipoprotein lipases will tear off pieces from the VLDL, and the VLDL gets smaller, and then they turn into LDL. So LDL stands for low density lipoproteins, and they will then finish delivering the lipids and cholesterol to the body cells from the liver. The LDL are also called bad cholesterol, and that's because they will cause fatty plaques to build up in the arteries, and that's called atherosclerosis, and that can eventually lead to heart attacks and strokes. So the way I think about the LDL is I think about like a pickup truck, and you've put a bunch of leaves in the back of the pickup truck, and now you're driving down I-15. And as you're doing that, leaves are flying all out of the back of the pickup truck, all over the highway. So that's what LDL is like, okay? So as the LDL is traveling through your blood vessels, it's leaving a mess. It's flinging stuff everywhere. And the LDL, this bad cholesterol, will get oxidized, and it actually causes inflammation in the walls of the blood vessels, and that attracts some of the white blood cells to the area, and they try to eat the LDL, and they can't quite do that, and that causes inflammation, and that starts the formation of these plaques, and that leads to the atherosclerosis. So that's the bad cholesterol. The HDL is the high density lipoproteins, and these are good cholesterol because they're going to be taking any extra cholesterol lipids from the cells back to the liver, and as they're traveling from the cells back to the liver, they're kind of like street cleaners. So as they're traveling through the blood vessels, if they see a mess, they see some lipids that maybe the LDL dropped, they'll pick it up. And so they decrease the risk of the atherosclerosis and the fatty plaques building up in the blood vessels. So you definitely want a much higher amount of HDL than you do LDL. So a lot of times on your blood work, they're going to report the amount of LDL and HDL, and they give you a ratio, and you want a lot higher HDL than you do LDL. And that just means that you've got a lot more good cholesterol than you do bad cholesterol, and that decreases your risk of getting a heart attack or a stroke later on. So let's just draw this out. Oops, before we draw this out, let's just take a look at a picture of sizes of these lipoproteins. So remember that the lipids have to travel in the blood as a lipoprotein, because remember the lipids are hydrophobic. They don't mix well with the water in the blood, so you've got to add some proteins in there with them, so then they'll mix better with the water in the blood. So that's why we do this. So the chylomicrons made by the intestines, they're the largest, and they're going to be traveling from the intestines to the cells and to the liver. The VLDL, the very low density lipoproteins, they're the next largest in size. These are made by the liver, and they're going to be taking cholesterol and other lipids made by the liver out to the body cells. And they're very low density, meaning they have lots of lipids and cholesterol and not as many proteins. And then the VLDL will turn into the LDL, the bad cholesterol, as it travels through the blood and it gets pieces taken off by the by the lipoprotein lipases. It gets smaller and turns into the LDL. Okay. And then the HDL is the good cholesterol. That's made by your body cells, and it's going to take the extra cholesterol lipids that the body cells say, hey, I actually don't need this, and it'll return it back to the liver, and then the liver will get rid of it. Okay, and the HDL has not as many lipids and more protein to it, so it's a lot more dense, and so it's more likely to sink if you put it into a glass of water. And there's a really good video here that explains the difference between these lipoproteins, so I highly recommend that you listen to that. So I did update that. If you downloaded the Chapter 3 PowerPoint, I did re-upload that, and I did update that link for you guys. Okay, so let's draw these lipoproteins out just so we can summarize them and keep them all straight. So let's start with our lipids in our diet. So maybe we ate some eggs or something, and so we go to our intestines, and we're going to be packaging up those lipids into chylomicrons. And the chylomicrons will then travel through the lymphatic system, get dumped into the blood, and then will travel to the liver and then to the body cells and then deliver lipids to both of those places. And then the liver is going to take the lipids that were delivered from the chylomicrons and then make some new lipids from them. So maybe make some things like cholesterol or phospholipids or maybe some triglycerides, whatever it needs to make. And it's going to make the VLDL, so the very low density lipoproteins. And then that's going to take the lipids made by the liver out to the body cells. And remember that as the VLDL lipoproteins are traveling through the blood and then they get pieces taken off of them by the enzymes, they get smaller and turn into the LDL lipoproteins. Okay, so this is the bad cholesterol. Okay, and so the LDL will then deliver the cholesterol and other lipids to the body cells. And how the cells will take in the LDL lipoproteins is they put out receptors and take it in by receptor-mediated endocytosis. So that's how it gets in. Okay, and then the cells, if they decide, hey, I've got too much cholesterol, too many, phospholipids or whatever, they decide, hey, I've got to get rid of some of these extra lipids. They're going to package it up into the HDL lipoprotein. Remember, that's the good cholesterol, because remember, that's like the street cleaner. And as it travels through the blood vessels back to the liver, it will kind of clean up any cholesterol or things it finds lying around in the blood vessels and help prevent some of those plaques from forming in the blood vessels. So that's the good cholesterol. And then the liver will get rid of extra cholesterol through the bile, secrete that into the intestine, or it might just reuse it and send it back out to the cells again. But that's a good summary of these lipoproteins. And it's really important to understand these because patients are going to ask you about these. And you probably have had this measured on your blood work too and might have wondered, what are all these things? And so this is what they are. So definitely know these for the exam. Know what these different lipoproteins are. Okay, and then here's just another picture showing you these lipoproteins. So if we start at the top, we've got some fats we've eaten in our diets coming down our intestine here. And if we kind of take a close-up view, here's our intestinal wall. We're going to absorb the lipids here, and we're going to remake the triglycerides inside the intestinal cell. It gets packaged up into the chylomicron, that really big lipoprotein, and then that'll get secreted from the cell by exocytosis. It's too big to fit in the capillaries, so it goes into the lymphatic vessels, and then eventually gets dumped in the bloodstream by the right side of the heart, and that will deliver lipids to the liver, and then also will take lipids to the body cells as well. And then the liver will take the lipids that have been delivered to it and make some new ones, package them up into the VLDL lipoproteins, the very low density lipoproteins. And then the VLDL lipoproteins will take lipids from the liver out to the body cells. So that'll travel through the blood vessels. And then those lipoprotein lipase enzymes in the blood vessel walls, they will take pieces off the VLDL and make it smaller. And the VLDL will then turn into the LDL lipoproteins. And that's the bad cholesterol. So that will make a mess as it's going through the blood vessel walls and can lead to the buildup of fatty plaques, the atherosclerosis in the blood vessel wall, which can increase the risk of heart attack and stroke. And then the LDL will deliver the cholesterol and other lipids to the body cells, and that gets taken in by receptor-mediated endocytosis. And then the body cells, if they have extra cholesterol or other lipids that they don't want anymore, they'll package it up into the HDL. So remember that lipoprotein is the good cholesterol, and the HDL will take the cholesterol and other lipids from the body cells back to the liver. And then the liver will dispose of the extra cholesterol through the bile, which gets secreted into the intestine and then goes out through the stool. Or some of it could just be recycled again and reused. Okay, and then back to our picture again, figure 21.1. How do lipids enter the cells? So remember that lipids being hydrophobic, they can just diffuse right through the cell membrane. So they don't need any kind of transport protein. So they can just diffuse in. Okay, and then lipid catabolism, so breaking down the triglycerides. So we're going to be storing the triglycerides in adipocytes, which are fat cells. And here's a picture of these here. All of this clear stuff, those are all triglycerides, and they get packed full, and then the nucleus gets shoved off to the side. So they get really full. And the triglycerides will get broken down when you haven't eaten for a while and you're like, hey, nutrients are running low and we need to start breaking down our triglycerides and releasing some of this to make some ATP and give this to other cells. So the process of breaking triglycerides down, that's called lipolysis. And that makes sense. Lipo referring to lipids, lysis to break apart or split. So we're just going to take the triglyceride and break it into the components. We've got the glycerol, which is just a modified sugar, and then the 3 fatty acid chains. Okay, so the glycerol being a modified sugar, we can just feed that into the first step of aerobic respiration, glycolysis, and then go through and make ATP from that. The fatty acid chains are really long, and so we need to break them into little 2-carbon pieces. So that process of breaking the fatty acid chains into little 2-carbon pieces, that's called beta oxidation. And the little 2-carbon pieces that are made is acetyl-CoA. So the fatty acid chains are made into a bunch of acetyl-CoA, which is then fed into the Krebs cycle, and then you can make a bunch of ATP from that. If you end up breaking down a lot of triglycerides, so for example, if you have a type 1 diabetic who is not secreting insulin, and maybe they're not well regulated at all, they're not maybe taking their insulin, they're not able to use any of their glucose that's in the blood, and so they're going to be breaking down their triglyceride stores. And so they're breaking down lots and lots of triglycerides, and so the acetyl-CoA starts to build up, and it can't all go into the Krebs cycle, so the body's like, well, we got to get rid of it. So the liver will convert some of the acetyl-CoA into these ketones. Okay, and the ketones can be used especially by things like the brain to make ATP. But the problem with the ketones is if you get too many of them, the ketones themselves are actually acidic. And so if you have a type 1 diabetic breaking down too many fats and you get too many ketones, you can get them going into a diabetic ketoacidosis because they get too many of these ketones being produced, and then it makes their blood pH too acidic, and that causes all kinds of problems because you've got to maintain homeostasis with your blood pH, and they get too acidic. So that causes problems. Okay, we can also do lipogenesis, and if you look at that word, genesis, remember, means to produce or form, so we can make lipids. So you can actually get fat from eating a low-fat diet if you eat too many proteins or too many carbs. Okay, so how this works is if you eat too many proteins, you can certainly work your way over and make fats from the amino acids. And if you eat too many carbs, you can certainly work your way over and make fats from the carbs. Okay, so that's lipogenesis. Where lipogenesis occurs in the body, that will occur in the fat cells, so the adipocytes, and then also the liver. And as you've noticed, the liver is involved in a lot of nutrient processing. So if you're ever in doubt about metabolism, liver is a pretty good guess for a lot of things. So